We'll be starting in just a moment. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining this webinar on California drought, tackling water risks for agriculture and apparel, hosted by Ceres. My name is Robin Miller, a manager at Ceres on our water team, and I am delighted to be co-hosting this webinar today with my colleague Cindy Clark from our policy team, who you will meet soon. As folks are joining, we will be creating a word cloud to get a sense of how you all are feeling about the California drought. To submit your thoughts, you can visit the link in the chat directly, or you can go to menti.com on a browser on your computer, a tablet, or your phone and enter the code 99136848. We have allowed you to enter multiple words or short phrases, and they will auto-populate on this slide as you enter those in. So I'll invite folks as you're joining to share your thoughts around how you're feeling about the California drought. We will also be using this platform for a few other questions throughout this session. So some big words here: dread, climate anxiety. Some people are feeling worried, feeling the situation is urgent. And word clouds, for those of you who are familiar, as the more often you enter in a word, you'll see that word get bigger. So I'm seeing climate anxiety be, a big piece. We'll give this a bit more time to see what folks are thinking. And thanks for sharing. Yeah, some people are not surprised to see this. Seeing that it's man-made, people are feeling anxious, concerned, urgent. Well, thank you all for participating in this word cloud, and we will be continue to add to this. But we will also have a few more moments like this throughout the webinar. We also, on the next slide, are going to be sharing a bit what's going to happen today. We have a great slate of speakers, and I'll introduce those speakers in a moment. On the logistics front, I want to note that participants can submit questions through Zoom, but we won't be taking questions live on this session today. We have created a resource page where we will post the recording, the slides, and some additional learning opportunities, and we'll do the best that we can to sort through your questions and continue to add to that resource page. I also want to note that this webinar was originally set for 45 minutes, but I anticipate we may fill the full hour with the robust discussion and speakers that we have today. So as mentioned, it's going to be recorded, and we will make that recording available afterwards. With that, I will share our speaker lineup. First, we will have some opening remarks from the California State Controller, Betty P. Yee, who is also a Ceres board member. Then we will hear from Cora Kameyer, senior researcher at the Pacific Institute, on the state of drought in California, the impacts on commodities key to agricultural and apparel production, and opportunities for collective action. And finally, we'll hear from Tim Carey, VP of Sustainability at PepsiCo, who will speak to some of the innovative solutions the company is implementing around water in California. Before I move into the program, I want to provide a brief overview of Ceres and the two teams bringing you this webinar. Ceres was founded by a group of investors in 1989 in response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and Ceres works to leverage the power of the capital markets to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. Over the past 30 years, Ceres has approached this challenge with a unique theory of change, and that is of making the financial case for sustainability to the largest and most influential investors, companies, policymakers, and regulators. By now, I assume most of you have seen the release of the newest IPCC report, And this report further solidifies the scientific evidence that human activities are causing extreme weather and other effects on the planet. And this also forecasts more intense impacts than scientists previously expected. On a note around water, I saw that it received a lot more attention in this report, with one estimate of it being mentioned over 400 times in this iteration of the IPCC report. So speaking of work on water, Ceres has been working on this topic now for over a dozen years. We've produced several reports and supported several initiatives that you can see on this slide. Of note currently is our work with the government of the Netherlands and many other partners on the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. This work is forging the scientific and business case for increased action on water from both companies and institutional investors. There are many more ways to learn and get involved with this initiative that we'll share at the close of the webinar and through our resource page. So now I want to introduce my colleague, Cindy Clark, who manages our policy efforts in California, to share more about our policy work at Ceres broadly and specific in California. So Cindy, I will hand over the virtual mic to you.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate that. Yes, Cindy Clark, Policy Manager. I am in Northern California, where I was born and raised and have been through several droughts now. Today, I'm going to do a quick dive into our policy work here at Ceres. The foundation of our work is the BICEP network. It was created over 12 years ago. It started with about 3 companies, and as you can see, we're up to 70 real leaders in the US. We advocate for state and at the state and federal level for climate and energy policy, as well as climate resilience. Our companies join sign-on letters, and we host many in-person and in-Zoom meetings, as well as help with op-eds. Next slide, please. Under the BICEP umbrella, we have Ceres Connect the Drops. So this organization was founded during the last drought, and these businesses champion for resilient water solutions for California. We've had so many successes in water conservation legislation, reuse, and safe and affordable drinking water. And this year, we, along with our companies, advanced water rate assistance, which resulted in a $1 billion rate relief signed into law by the governor just last month. Next slide, please. And finally, just this spring, we launched our Ceres Climate Smart Agriculture and Healthy Soil Working Group. So right now we've got 15 companies involved and growing. And these companies are advancing federal solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in food and fiber supply chains, as well as support farming practices that reduce water use and increase water quality. Back to you, Robin.
Thank you, Cindy. And I'm now very pleased to introduce our next segment, where we will hear some opening remarks from the California State Controller, Betty Yee. Betty couldn't join us live today, so she sent her remarks over to us in a pre-recorded video. I want to add that in addition to her role as the California State Controller, Controller Yee is also a member of the Ceres Board of Directors and a founding member of the Ceres Valuing Water Finance Task Force. So on to her remarks.
Hello, and welcome to this series webinar on water risks in California, a topic of increasing importance to companies, investors, policymakers, and especially those of us who live in California. Please join me in taking a moment to honor the California Native American communities across the state for persisting, carrying on diverse cultural and linguistic traditions, and sustainably managing the land that we now inhabit. Native people have maintained a constant presence on the landscape for many thousands of years. They are essential stewardship partners, whether along the coast, along our rivers and valleys, or in our fragile deserts. We thank California Native American communities for their essential role in maintaining and adding to for our state's rich cultural legacy. As California's controller, I recognize climate risk as a growing, overarching concern for the dozens of boards and commissions on which I serve. As a Ceres board member and founding member of the Valuing Water Task Force, I understand the intrinsic link between climate and water. I strongly value water and its stewardship and look forward to helping build the resources, tools, and leadership necessary to align company goals with economic and environmental imperatives. The issues in California surrounding water are complex and layered. Today's webinar will focus on some specific challenges and opportunities for the agriculture and apparel sectors, and ways that investors can become more aware of these topics as they engage with their companies in their portfolios. We've seen the news on water scarcity in California. However, a drive down any California highway or road starts to reveal the true urgency facing every Californian and anyone who visits or does business in the Golden State. The water crisis is here, now. 3/4 of California's water is consumed by agriculture. 2/3 of the nation's fruits and nuts and 1/3 of the nation's vegetables are produced in California. In 2019, California had $21.7 billion of agricultural exports, yet many of our state's farms are in a precarious position as California experiences epic droughts. Fields have gone fallow due to lack of water, and this is likely the new normal. We are living through the worst drought conditions in modern history. California drought monitoring has 5 levels. 100% of California falls into the first category, abnormally dry. The majority of California is in the 2 most drought intense categories, with 85% of California in at least extreme drought and 1/3 in exceptional drought. This translates to a year-round fire season, inadequate water supplies, business disruptions, health and sanitation concerns, and low survival rates for native plants and animals. Water access has long been a contentious issue that pits communities against each other in a desperate fight for resources and way of life. In California, it is estimated that 1 million people do not have access to safe drinking water. This crisis has been exacerbated by the growing threats caused by climate change. The climate crisis accelerates the water crisis, and many people are left to bear the worst of it. Moreover, 1.8 million households in California acquired water debt during the pandemic. These households owe a combined $1 billion in unpaid bills, with the average debt around $500, a troublesome amount for any household, let alone one already in crisis. While urban areas seem less affected by drought, low-income rural communities that predominantly rely on wells that are drying up face the most dire impacts, as under-resourced regions where infrastructure needs traditionally have been ignored. There are so many daunting aspects of California's water crisis. What can be done to address them? In the investment community, water doesn't always get the attention it deserves in ESG, but that is where we must continue to push for change on climate action. Investors and companies do not have the luxury of first working on carbon and climate issues and then turning to water. We need to think about water now. Companies and investors must play stronger stakeholder and leadership roles on water issues. No company on this globe can operate without water. To achieve action at scale, we need to move beyond simply recognizing the importance of water issues. In the past, stakeholders were primarily focused on the need for large companies to show more leadership on water issues, but increasingly, institutional investors are being seen as critically important stakeholders, as they often are exposed to entire sectors and industries and can push for change at scale in terms of how water risks and issues are managed. As the Ceres roadmap for 2030 highlights, companies will decouple business growth from the destruction of natural ecosystems and commit to becoming resource positive, giving back more than they take from the planet, in a way that strengthens ecosystems and prioritizes resource access for vulnerable communities. As policymakers and leaders in this arena, we must give business owners the tools and information to make this possible. As a board member of CalSTRS and CalPERS, the two largest public pension funds in the United States, I am pleased that both funds have made notable progress through shareholder proposals on water risk management and direct engagements with companies around their water stewardship efforts. And as part of the Ceres team building the business case for water stewardship, yes, I know these issues are dire. However, overcoming them is within our reach if we continue to sound the alarm and take measurable action in the urgent months and years ahead. Water is the lifeblood of our planet, critical for all human, animal, and plant survival, and vital for healthy and growing and developing economies. Think about it. The ultimate stranded asset related to water is people. With this as our guiding compass, the tools and resources of Ceres and others to aid investors and companies, and the promising actions and experiences you will learn about in this webinar, I hope you will elevate your commitment to water stewardship and act now to build a sustainable tomorrow. Thank you.
Wow, what powerful remarks from Controller Yi. Thank you for reflecting on the challenging situation in the Golden State and for sharing your wisdom and a path forward. So now we'll dive more into the specifics of the drought in California with Cora Kammeyer from the Pacific Institute. But before I hand it off to Cora, I want to encourage folks to get your Menti polling back up, as Cora will have a few questions that we will be sharing through the Menti throughout her presentation. The link is in the chat, and the code will also be available when we get to those sections. So Cora, I will hand the virtual mic over to you.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks everyone for attending the webinar today. I'm going to build on Controller Yi's remarks around California's drought conditions and risk to business, and then also hopefully turn to a more positive note and talk about some water stewardship solutions. Next slide, please. So as a quick introduction, I'm Cora Kammeyer. I'm a senior researcher at the Pacific Institute. And for those not familiar with the Pacific Institute, we're a nonprofit based in Oakland, California. And since 1987, we have worked with everyone from Fortune 500 companies to disadvantaged communities to create and advance solutions to the world's most pressing water challenges. We have 3 focus areas guiding our work, as you can see on the slide. And our work is global, operating from a local to a national and international spectrum. Next slide. Since 2007, the Pacific Institute has acted as co-secretariat of the UN Global Compact CEO Water Mandate, which is a global commitment platform for corporate water stewardship. The initiative has about 200 endorsing companies who commit to water stewardship action, and we provide resources and best practice guidance for companies seeking to advance their water stewardship efforts. Before I dive into the main content of my presentation, I do want to acknowledge and honor the native lands on which I sit. Normally, I live in Santa Barbara, California, which is Chumash lands, but today I'm actually speaking to you from Washougal, Washington, which is land of the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, of the Grand Ronde, and the Cowlitz Indian tribes. I want to acknowledge, particularly in the context of water, the harms inflicted upon Native Americans by white settlers to the Western US, and acknowledge the abundance of Native wisdom around how to sustainably manage natural resources here in the West. Nature-based solutions is a focus of the Pacific Institute. It's become a hot topic within the corporate sustainability world, but that concept draws upon and relates to centuries of tribal ecological knowledge and practices. Next slide. So now I'm going to dig into some detail on drought conditions in California. To start that out, I would just like to give an overview for those who might not be totally familiar with California's water systems. California has always experienced periodic droughts as a semi-arid region. And throughout the past century, it has been highly engineered and influenced by humans. I think settlers of California always dreamed it to be a wetter place than it actually is, and have built massive infrastructure projects to get the water supplies needed to support huge population and economic growth over the past century. And three key pieces of California water infrastructure to be aware of are the State Water Project and Central Valley Project, which carry water through north to south throughout the state of California, and also the Colorado River Aqueduct, which imports water supplies from the Colorado River watershed. Today, California's water supplies are about 60% surface and 40% groundwater, supporting a population of 40 million people and almost 10 million acres of agriculture. So now turning to drought conditions of today. Controller Yi did speak to this. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, and I'm sure you've all seen on the news, that almost all of the American West, not just California, are now in a drought, with 86% of the entire West facing severe drought conditions, shown here in orange, and about a quarter of the region in that dark red of exceptional drought, which is the worst category. This is the second dry year in a row for California, and for the broader Colorado River Basin, this is part of a 20-year trend of aridification. And this is all part of a climate change influence pattern of declining water supply reliability. On the lower left side of the screen, you can see the statistics on 2021 precipitation levels as a percent of normal, and you'll see that most major cities in California are below half normal rainfall. Reservoir levels too are hitting historic lows. Just last week, Lake Oroville dropped so low that it lost its ability to produce hydropower. Lake Mead as well has hit historically low water levels. Next slide. So beyond reservoir levels, our natural sources of water storage are depleted as well. And so I'll speak to snowpack here and groundwater on the next slide. California saw little snowfall this year, and what snow there was melted and evaporated quickly because of the warmer weather. The Sierra snowpack was gone by late May of this year, which is 2 months earlier than normal. And then groundwater is another essential source of natural water storage for California, and it's often what water users turn to when surface water supplies are diminished during drought. But because of the severe groundwater overdraft we've seen in the last several decades, we can no longer rely on groundwater as drought-proof supply. The many orange and red dots you see here on the map show decreases in groundwater levels throughout the state since 2010. And then the photos on either side are dramatic anecdotes of land subsidence due to dropping groundwater levels in California's Central Valley. So water is, of course, central to California's environment, society, and economy. And the negative impacts of drought combined with climate change and building on a history of water mismanagement are far-reaching and diverse, and everyone suffers. But two groups who have historically faced the worst drought impacts are small, rural, often poor, often communities of color that lose access to drinking water during drought. And then second, looking at freshwater ecosystems and salmon and other fish who are on the brink of extinction, and the economic and ecological and cultural values that are associated with those ecosystems. So you've heard me mention climate change throughout my remarks, but I want to make it really explicit that we cannot afford to address just climate and then water, or vice versa. They're intrinsically connected and we must solve for them together. Listed on the screen here are some of the ways in which drought and climate change interact. We use water to create energy through hydropower, and we use energy to deliver and treat water. Hot and dry conditions that come with drought are worsening wildfire risks. We have these dramatic swings between water extremes in California, from a super dry year to a super wet year, that are being driven by climate change. And lastly, sea level rise driven by climate change is causing salinity intrusion in California's ground and surface water sources, which is further threatening water supply reliability. So to close out this drought overview, I'll note that there's increasing recognition that droughts like these can no longer be considered rare, unexpected, or even abnormal. Extreme water conditions like this are the new normal under climate change, and to achieve water resilience, we'll need to adjust our responses and management systems accordingly. So now, how does this drought affect business? And to open up this part of the presentation, we're going to turn back to the Mentimeter and ask the audience, what do you think is the biggest water-related risk to business in California? I'll give folks a few minutes to get back online and fill that out. We're seeing some answers start to pop up here. Lack of water supply for agricultural production, cost of water, food supply, loss of agricultural productivity, supply chain, food, sanitation, energy, water intensive crops, more supply chain disruption. Okay, great. Thanks all for filling this out. And I'll speak to a lot of this in my remarks going forward. So I want to step back for a moment and just do a quick 101 on water risk. So of course, intuitively, businesses with supply chains and operations in California have increased water risk during drought. And this graphic from the CEO Water Mandate helps provide an overview of the drivers and types of water-related risks to business, which I think is a good, helpful framework for thinking about it. So first, in the rectangles, the green rectangles, water risks can stem from both the actions of a business, for example, a farm's water use, and also the broader conditions of the watershed, which are typically out of a business's control. And then the risk can manifest in three key ways: physical risk, simply not enough water to support business operations; reputational risk, this might be a large water using business lose social license to operate or receive negative press due to their water use; and then the third is regulatory risk, water allocation cutoffs or reductions or other government actions in response to drought that affect business. So on this slide, I want to call out some of the key water-related risks that farmers in California face. This is, of course, not all of them, but I wanted to speak to these particular. First, I think some historic background. Many farmers are reliant on government subsidized water allocations that often cost far less than they are worth, which means that the value of water is not reflected in business operations, which can increase risk during times of shortage. And then also, especially this year, now that there is a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in place in California, we're seeing during this drought, farmers getting squeezed between dramatic reductions in allocations and availability of surface water supplies, and also reduced groundwater availability. And this is leading to many researchers in California saying that we may need to take some land out of production and put it to other uses in California, with some estimates saying that 750,000 acres of agricultural lands may need to transition to less water intensive uses. And lastly, of course, water is connected to so many other challenges that we care about in the agricultural context that can include water quality, air quality, loss of biodiversity, extreme heat, wildfire, social inequity. And so water is a common thread throughout all of these. Despite these many challenges, it's worth noting that California's agricultural economy has actually held up well, even grown in past droughts. As you can see in this chart showing farm revenues over the past few decades, revenues actually peaked in 2014, which was one of California's driest years on record. While I wish I could say this is a sign of resilience, I think it instead shows how agriculture has gotten by with, in many cases, unsustainable practices, depleting rivers and groundwater sources that may not be able to be sustained going into the future, particularly in the face of climate change. A final slide on water risk to agriculture. It's important to remember that different crops have different water needs and therefore often different vulnerability to drought. So this chart from the Pacific Institute shows the water footprints of different crop types, and farmers who are growing lower water use annual crops like, say, grains or tomatoes may face lower risk during drought than a farmer growing a high use permanent tree crop like almonds. So now with that overview of drought conditions and risks to business, we're going to try and change the tone to something more positive and talk about water stewardship solutions. And to kick that off, we're going to do one last Mentimeter poll. And so if you could go back to the Menti webpage and respond to the question, what kinds of water stewardship solutions do you want to see in California? We're starting to see some answers coming in here, some nature-based solutions, soil health, efficiency, beaver wetland restoration, very specific, I like that. Harvesting water, indigenous stewardship. Great, these are all, yeah, exciting solutions. Stop subsidizing water for crops. Fair and thoughtful SIGMA implementation. For those not familiar with that acronym, that's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Okay, we're going to go ahead and continue with the presentation. Thanks for those responses. So starting off with some on-farm solutions. While we know that systemic change in California water management is needed, there are important on-farm actions that can be taken and that many farmers are taking to reduce water-related risks. These include things like investments in irrigation efficiency. There's really exciting technological innovation in this space, looking at remote sensing and soil moisture sensors and ways to be really accurate with water application to support not only water sustainability, but also crop health. Other on-farm best management practices, regenerative agriculture is a hot topic right now, which is really about building healthy soils to better hold both water and carbon. There is the option of switching to lower risk, lower water use crop types. And then two, shorter term actions that can be taken during drought that don't necessarily require a lot of advanced planning can be things like fallowing fields, which is leaving a field unplanted and unwatered. And then also looking to some of California's water market mechanisms and purchasing additional water for irrigation if there are willing sellers. Ultimately, though, we know that on-farm actions alone are not enough. At this point, a farm or a facility can be as water efficient and sustainable as possible, and they still can face high water risks due to conditions beyond their fence line. And this is why collective action is such a critical component of any company's water stewardship strategy. There are a handful of great collective action initiatives happening here in California, and I'm going to highlight 3 of them in the next section. So first is the California Water Action Collaborative, which we affectionately call QWAC. And QWAC is a group that I have been heavily involved in the past several years. And the idea of this group was actually similar to Ceres Connect the Drops, born out of the last drought in 2014, in a meeting hosted by CEO Water Mandate. And essentially, the attendees of that meeting were asking, how can I get more involved and how can I better address water-related risks to business and advance California's water security? So now, several years later, QWAC has evolved into a more formal coalition with 30 corporate and NGO members who collaborate on joint water stewardship projects, who set shared goals, who share lessons learned, and have biannual in-person meetings. So next slide, please. In pre-COVID times, we would actually meet in a different California watershed twice a year, go on learning journeys in that watershed and share lessons learned and best practices from our water stewardship projects that we were all working on together. We now have a portfolio of about a dozen collective action projects throughout the state, and those range from headwaters to farms to cities. And we track the outcomes of these collective action projects against 6 water-related goals, which you can see here in the colorful boxes in the center of the slide. And it's really exciting and powerful to see the cumulative impacts of our combined efforts on California's water systems. The next collective action example I want to highlight is the Water Resilience Coalition, or the WRC, which is a new initiative of the CEO Water Mandate that launched last year. The WRC is a CEO-led initiative that seeks to accelerate action to address the global water crisis. You can see the founding members of the coalition on the slide here. Next slide. So last year, the WRC members identified 11 priority regions in 5 countries around the world, and California came forth as one of those priority regions. So now, in coordination with QAC and other California NGOs and programs, the WRC is launching its own collective action projects throughout the state. Last but not least is Ceres Connect the Drops campaign. This was already spoken to at the beginning of the webinar, so I won't spend too much time on this other than just to say that Connect the Drops members have supported some really important and much needed water policies in California, from urban water conservation to protecting safe drinking water and more. And I think responsible corporate engagement in policy like this is a kind of new frontier and is a really important space to be working in. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone for listening. Encourage you to explore more with the links on this page, and these will also be on the webinar webpage. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the Ceres folks.
Thank you so much, Cora. It was really a thoughtful analysis of California's really stark water situation. But we also really appreciate you providing some hopeful solutions. And so up next, we're also delighted to welcome Tim Carey. So Tim is Vice President of Sustainability at PepsiCo. He is currently going to be speaking with us from Madison, Wisconsin, but he has lived throughout his career in all the Western states, including some time he spent in Southern California at the Metropolitan Water District. So Tim, if you would like to join us, I should mention too, that PepsiCo is a member of Connect the Drops, as well as our Climate Smart Agriculture and Healthy Soil Working Group. Take it away, Tim.
All right, thank you, Cindy. It's great to be here. I'm Tim Carey, and as Cindy mentioned, I'm a Westerner. I lived in 12 different cities in the West, 4 in California, Arizona, Denver twice, Calgary, I think that's part of the West, Canadian West at least, and then 4 or 5 in the state of Oregon. And so I get it. I mean, water it's more valuable than the price suggests. And certainly Cora talked about that. Before going too much further, though, I want to talk a little bit about our goals. You can see those on the next page. And the first on the left are operational. Reduce our water use intensity in high-risk areas. That includes basically all of the West by 25%. And this is building on a goal we had sunsetted in 2015 and started in about 2004, 2005 of 20% improvement. So if you're in a beverage company like mine, you put water in a bottle. And so we're basically saying between those 2 sets of goals, we will remove or improve our efficiency by 50% for the most part between when we started 2005 and when we hope to sunset this next set in 2025. So that's one goal. The second is implementing something called the Alliance for Water Stewardship in our high-risk areas. And that's really a program that integrates the manufacturing plant and our company with the community. It's a global standard. And the idea is, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a minute, but is to be engaged in the conversation, not just in a one-off way, but with everyone in the community. But focusing on ourselves is not nearly enough. So we also have goals outside our fence line, the first of which is to replenish 100% of the water that we use in the watershed where the water comes from. And the idea is that you don't contribute to scarcity. Hopefully you don't contribute to pricing increases. You don't contribute to the issue as much as possible. Now, some of these ideas are a little abstract. That is when I do reforestation in a burn scar. In theory, that should save water. It should improve percolation. It should increase ground shade. It should do all of these things that have an impact on water quantity and quality. And we're trying to say, model it out and say, does that represent some of what we use? But the idea is to over deliver, in effect, to replenish what we pull into our factories and what we use at 100% level. That's the first one on the beyond our walls. The second one is to partner to improve water efficiency in our agricultural supply chain. And so our supply chain in agriculture does exist in the West. I mean, and in California, we buy potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, almonds from the state of California, from the West. And we want to make sure that our growers in the network improve too. And so we have this goal of 15% improvement. We didn't know if this would be possible, if they would agree to it. They don't grow just for us. In some cases, they only grow materials for us on the odd years. On the even years, they rotate something else through the system. And so the idea, though, is like it's about more than the fence line inside what we own. It's about the entire network. But before I go too much further, I want to tell you, where do we make products? You can see on the next slide, we have about 12 manufacturing locations, excluding Hawaii, which I don't show on this map, in the West. I mean, there's 3 kind of in the Bay Area, one in Hayward, one in Oakland, one in Sacramento, one up there in the Tumwater area of Western Washington. We've got a facility in Fresno, 3 in Southern California, 2 in the Phoenix area, and then 1 in Denver. And if you overlay the map that Cora shared, showing the latest state of the US drought, you can see that basically every facility we have in the Western United States is either in an abnormally dry condition or severe, extreme, or exceptional drought condition. And when you talk about climate, if we lose supply in these locations because it's not available or there's higher, more important uses, but there's still demand for our products, we're going to ship them from 1,000 miles away or further. I mean, Denver to the coast is about 1,000 miles. And so the idea is that you create a carbon problem if you don't solve a water problem. So our idea is to be efficient users of water. One of the interesting things is this map is still too abstract, despite these graphic colors. So I want you to look at a picture of, and you've seen this picture before, this is Lake Oroville, how it looked basically a year ago. And for those of you who don't know, Lake Oroville impounds the Feather River. It's in Butte County in Northern California. It's the 2nd largest reservoir in the California system. And it's also one of the key components of the state water project supply network, which delivers water to Los Angeles and other parts of the state. And if you look at Lake Oroville this past April, the next slide shows what it looked like. And so the water is missing. It's like, what happened to it? It seems to have disappeared to a remarkable extent, significantly faster than the last drought experience we had in 2013, 14, 15 timeframe. And if you look at Lake Oroville just last month, this is how it looked. I find it remarkable that this is 25% of the supply network from Lake Oroville. Is at 25% of capacity. And you can see a patch of blue up there beyond the bridge. So there is still some water, but the entire storage capacity of this reservoir has disappeared in a single year. And this is not just supply for us, for our manufacturing operations, but for agriculture, for communities, for everyone that Cora mentioned. And it is 243 feet below full storage capacity. And so we have a challenging problem, and we are on a whipsaw. And the whipsaw is recurring droughts. And so here's what we are doing about it in part, and here's what everybody who participates in the system should do about it. The first is start with risk assessments. And I don't mean like, what's my risk, my financial risk, although that is part of it, but it's like, what's the risk that you will be, or the community that you share water with will be in a drought situation or supply curtailment situation. So that's the first thing. And understand that there's some great tools out there like the aqueduct model from WRI, but there are some tools that don't exist really. One of those is based on groundwater. And to give you an example, we recently added to our list of water scarce or water risk locations, a facility in Florida. And if you recall the map I showed, Florida has no issues. But when you look at groundwater, it's hard to measure the issue because there is saltwater intrusion and other characteristics. So you have to understand your supply risk and what it means to your business and the community. That's the first. The second is develop, and this is obvious, I know, develop value chain wide goals and objectives. It's not enough to say my factory will be more water or conservation oriented will improve their use. Let's go beyond the factory into the value chain, because we sometimes put water in the form of food in a package that may or may not leave the watershed. And the third on the short term is like, go after water use reductions. I mean, do not hesitate, get started. During the previous drought, we improved over the course of about 18 months our water use efficiency, even though we had been at it for years, by 20 percentage points. And one of the interesting things is the state of California demand remains 16% below where it was in 2013 at the beginning of that drought, when then Governor Jerry Brown signed the executive order. And so we know it can be done. The thing is, get after it and continue to make improvements. I'll talk about a few of the technologies in a moment. I won't show you those, but I'll mention them. On the longer term side, replenish the water that you use in the watershed that supplies it. That's the critical piece. Water is a local issue, as you know. If I use water in California or in the Colorado western side of the slope, and I replenish it in the Mississippi River, I'm not really helping much for the drought situation out west. We're not going to move water that distance. So the idea is do it in the watershed. And there are a lot of nature-based solutions that can come to play here. They can be as simple as, wetlands rehabilitation. Wetlands are natural ways to conserve water. They can be as simple as reforestation of burn scars, or as easy as phreatophyte removal. For those of you who don't recall from your botany class what a phreatophyte is, it's a type of plant that has a very significant and sizable root structure that goes to the water table and consumes water directly from the water table. And it can go hundreds of feet below the ground surface. And typically these are invasive species. So the idea is like, they're invasive and they don't belong, and they're consuming groundwater at a remarkable rate, which affects stream flow, affects lake reservoir levels, et cetera. They can be removed. There are other solutions that are more not nature-based, but traditional. And they're as simple as working with local agricultural organizations or farmers to change their irrigation approaches. We did one in Arizona, and this startled me. We were in Arizona just a few years ago, and the farmers would drive out to their berms to flood irrigate. And on the berms, they would remove wooden panels that control the level of water in the canal. And so they'd drive out, remove the panel, and then they would drive back and do other things on their farm, only to return, hours later to put the wooden baffles back into the irrigation ditch channel. And that was the state of technology just a few years ago. And so we said, well, could we automate that? What if we bought you an automated system that you could control with your phone? He's like, I wouldn't have to drive out to the berm. Like, no, you wouldn't have to drive out there. You mean I could set a timer and only flood irrigate for 15 or 20 minutes rather than whenever I get back? That's exactly right. And so you should not think of the West necessarily as state of the art in all cases. It clearly is sometimes, but there's a lot of opportunity. The term low-hanging fruit comes to mind. And so that's one idea, that improving irrigation, whether it's going to drip or going to low water pivot from flood, any of those systems, going to crop rotations, doing groundwater injection. We're working with the Water Replenishment District of Southern California to make sure that water, what they call high quality effluent, exiting treatment plants, doesn't just go out into the ocean, but manages to make it into the groundwater system to provide long-term supply. Fallowing is another approach. A third is to do crop rotations that use water at different times of the year so that they're not consuming water in low flow periods or during super high temperatures, but instead that water stays in stream. I mean, there are a number of creative ideas. We work with partners like the Arbor Day Foundation, as I mentioned, Water Replenishment District of Southern California, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, to help plan and implement solutions that capture and retain water. So those are a few ideas. The other longer term thought is to partner with local municipalities, NGOs, farmers, and others to understand plans and ways to mitigate. I find it amazing in a big company like PepsiCo we've got teams of individuals focused on everything we buy, whether it's, aluminum or plastic materials or manufacturing equipment or sweeteners or oranges, all of those things, teams of people focused on them to make sure we understand the system, we know where we get supply, we understand when scarcity might arrive or how that our prices may be affected. When it comes to water, we have no, or had no until recently, relationships. It showed up, we paid the bill, and we were fine, but we never really understood what does the network look like. That is antediluvian, to use a water term. And so the idea is, how do we create systems where all water users in a watershed work together to understand, are there things that we can do as a company to help a municipality invest in low flow fixtures for communities? Because that will save water, it will help us offset our demand. Without those conversations or relationships, these ideas don't necessarily come to the surface, or it doesn't make sense. We were actually asked by one organization, why are you giving us money? What do you want in return? And we said, we're not trying to buy anything. We're just trying to keep water in the system so that in a drought like the one we're facing and the one that may extend into next year, water still exists. And then finally, you've got to develop governance systems and processes to manage this, because the teams and the staff in your organizations, this is not a surprise, I hate to even mention it, but they come and go. And if you don't have a governance system, you will fall into decay. And we've seen it in some regards after the drought, where we saw a little bit of a rebound. Plant managers changed, staff went to other locations or took new jobs, and we kind of forgot what is it we were doing. And some of the things that we were doing included reusing water on site. It was basically taking water that had been through reverse osmosis and been into a process, capturing it and putting it into our cooling towers, which had historically used fresh water, doing the same with our boilers. We've done rainwater capture where it's legal. It's not legal in the state of Colorado, I don't think, or certainly not in Denver, but where it's legal to capture rainwater and reuse it. Certainly if you can prevent it from running off into the ocean where it's no longer useful. We've done production run strategies. You probably know the most efficient way to run a water operation is to have long manufacturing runs, to not change products, to not do changeovers, to not do cleaning in place because you've used a product that may require additional cleaning processing. So it's how do you get long production runs, because that will save you water. And then finally, one of my favorite ones of all time, you all probably know how a boiler works. We use boilers for pasteurization. They burn natural gas typically. And when you burn a natural gas product or any petroleum-based product, you create water vapor. So it's juvenile water, and then you blast it into the atmosphere. And so as part of our boiler process, what we do is we now condense boiler off gas to take the water out of the off gas. Again, that's water that was created through the process of combustion, and we condense it. And if you can imagine, it is millions of gallons a year at single manufacturing locations that we used to just blow into the atmosphere. We now condense it, capture it, reuse it in our process operations. The list of ideas is too numerous to go through them, but the only thing I'll leave you with is, if you do have a reverse osmosis system, they are perhaps the most water wasteful systems in a manufacturing plant. They can reject as much as 15%, even more, of the water that comes in, the water that you buy, the water that comes from a water manufacturing plant in your city. And so you've got to get your reverse osmosis systems to operate in 90 plus, 95% plus efficiency ratings. And the best way to do that is to use, innovative technologies, or just to put these systems in series, so that you take the brine from one process, you put it into the next one downstream, create more purified water until you get to a very concentrated brine stream. There are a lot of things that you could do. I'd like to cover them all, but I don't have time. But I've been doing water conservation in PepsiCo manufacturing plants for 14 continuous years. We've made a lot of progress, and we are yet to run out of ideas about how we can be more conservation oriented, not just in our plants, but in the networks that supply us. Cindy, I think that's it. So back to you.
Wow, Tim, that was really, really incredible. From those really striking photos of Lake Oroville. And I'll tell you, here in California, that's not unusual. Of course, not all of our lakes are that low, but many of our lakes are that low. And then, your approach to water stewardship, and it's so broad and all encompassing. I know Robin was smiling when you spoke about governance. And then I was jumping up and down when you spoke about working directly with the farmers and water replenishment in the same watershed as well. And with that, we are going to our call for action. And what this is some ideas on our audience's next steps. So if you're a company, we encourage you to go straight to Ceres 2030 Roadmap for guidance on managing water risks. And it's right there. There's a link there, but it's on our website. Or join one of the collective action groups that Cora mentioned today. Or join a Ceres policy network. And I think Robin's going to talk a little bit about what investors can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're an institutional investor on the line, we have a really great resource called the Investor Water Toolkit. It's not California specific, but it's a great starting point for looking at different types of water risk. And so we do have sections on a geographic specific approach. We have commodities. So I encourage you to dive into that resource. And as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, the Valuing Water Finance Initiative is looking for investors who are wanting to dive deep into looking at the financial, the business case, as well as the scientific case for this work. And then for companies and investors, as I mentioned, we are creating a landing page that will be available and shared with everyone who registered that will have a link to this recording, a link to the slide decks from our speakers, as well as some other resources mentioned. And there was a really great webinar, so we encourage any of you on the line, whether you're a company, investor, from an NGO, an academic. There was a really great webinar last week on drought in the West, hosted by Circle of Blue, Pacific Institute, and several other partners. So that's one resource among many. So we have one final Menti poll for you today. So we'd love to hear from folks. What are your key takeaways? What action steps are you planning to take? And Cindy and I will keep an eye and share out some of the thoughts that we're collecting.
Right. We hope our speakers provided a lot of great ideas for you. So this shouldn't be a tough one, right, Robin?
Yeah, you can also use our ideas that we just shared on our calls to action. But we'd love to get a little pulse of what folks are thinking from what we shared.
I love it. There it is, the Ceres 2030 Roadmap. Perfect.
Yeah, so reframing water stewardship efforts.
Learn more about initiatives.
Yeah, I like this one, checking in with suppliers on infrastructure investment needs. So you're really digging into that supply chain.
And there's the watershed collective action. Great, great idea.
Great.
And local work, always important.
Yeah. Well, I think we're actually needing to move to closing out the webinar. So what I'm taking away is that there's no getting around the reality that the drought in California is a serious concern and poses many risks to companies and investors who have some exposure in the region. But I'm also taking away that there are solutions available. And if we act now, and more importantly, if we act together through collective action, we can mitigate some of those risks and actually move towards a more water positive future. So I want to thank, Cindy, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, just wanted, we're just so excited about this. No, but I think everyone needs to really step up to build a resilient water future for the state, and no one can do this alone.
Yeah. So I want to thank all of our speakers, Betty, Cora, and Tim, for providing their knowledge and expertise. Cindy, I'm grateful to you for co-moderating this session. I always like when we can collaborate with our teams together. And I also want to thank all of you who joined us today for your time and attention. So as a reminder, we will make a recording of this webinar available, post that to our resource page, and you all should be getting a follow-up note within the next day or two with all of that in your email. So take care, be well, and enjoy the rest of your day.